Thank you all so much for joining Luxury Institute's webinar for an update on privacy, Apple, Google, and personal data. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be shared after the session. The recording will also be available on Luxury Institute's website and our YouTube channel. If you have any questions along the way, please feel free to use the Q&A box or the chat. We'll address as many questions as we can during the last 10 to 15 minutes of the session. If you would like to connect privately to ask any questions of our panelists, feel free to reach out to us directly. Now I'd like to hand it over to Luxury Institute CEO and DataLucent Chairman, Milton Pedraza. Milton?
Thank you, Katie, and thank you all for joining us today. One of the most fascinating changes in the digital economy is that data, personal data, has become the lifeblood of the business. It used to be raw materials, natural resources. Now it is data as the key resource. It fuels the digital economy and it fuels AI, the much often spoken about, but really data is the key to AI. Now, as a private investor and as an entrepreneur, I've been fascinated by all the changes, all the disruption that's going on right now. And that's why the title of our webinar is What's Next? An update on privacy, Apple, Google, and personal data. Very often I'm asked by executives, CEOs to explain what's going on in the personal data world. And I am an amateur at it. So today I invited two of the world's top experts, attorneys in their own right, but also social entrepreneurs. So I'm pleased to introduce Richard Whitt and Tim Moynihan. Richard, Tim, starting with Richard, please give us a little bit of a background on your career journey, please.
Thanks, Milton, and hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I am a public policy attorney by training, over 30 years in the space, beginning in the late 80s in law firm life, 12 years at MCI Communications, and then 11 plus years at Google, the last 4 years of which I served as corporate director for strategic initiatives. I would like to think that I have a pretty deep understanding of this intersection of public policy, business markets, and technologies. And particularly when we think about something like privacy and personal data, where all this is heading in the future, it can feel quite complex and even confusing. But I'm hoping today the conversation will help shed some light, particularly for those of you thinking about, on behalf of your customers and clients, where to move forward in the market space and how to take advantage of these coming changes.
Thank you, Richard. And Tim?
Thank you, everyone. Great to have you here. My name is Tim Moynihan. I'm a corporate and data licensing attorney by trade. Began my career at Forrester Research. Right after my first year of law school, I was hired as an intern and kind of never left. Ended up working at Forrester for the next 2 years of my law school career, was hired as corporate counsel right after I graduated, and started to ride the dot-com wave with a rapidly growing tech company. Most important to what we're talking about today, I was on the original launch teams for Forrester's data products. So Forrester started as a pure syndicated research play with no data to support the research, no direct data to support the research. And so we decided we needed to build some data assets. We launched consumer technographics and business technographics. I was on the launch teams for both. They became very large businesses for Forrester. They're still large businesses for Forrester. And it gave me really an in-depth education about how data licensing works at scale. Ended up general counsel at Forrester after a few years. And that was right around when the dot-com wave was about to unwind. So I got a fast education in how to right size a large public company at that point. After Forrester, I left and founded Moynihan Partners. We're a boutique law firm up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We represent companies similar to Forrester, data licensing companies, market research companies, software companies, businesses that need help monetizing and protecting valuable information products and IP. About 5 years ago, I was at a conference at Stanford, and a colleague convinced me of something that I just didn't want to believe was true, and that is that we have a different set of rights online than we do offline. So when we go on the internet, we lose a lot of our privacy, we lose a lot of our freedoms, and the things we give up online, we would never give up in the real world. So that problem set really bothered me from a legal standpoint, and I started to design some legal frameworks that basically took the existing legal frameworks of the internet, which is copyright, database licensing, and applied them to individuals. And that led to the launch of DataLucent, which is a startup we've been working on for the last few years that basically empowers consumers to take control of their data, turn it into a valuable asset that they can license back into the ecosystem, just like a Forrester or a Nielsen will license their valuable data.
Thank you, Tim. So now let's start with Apple and Google, because they made some very significant moves lately. So Richard, you're a former Googler, 11 years at Google. Tell us about what Google is doing and give us their motives. Tell us exactly what they're doing and tell us why you think they're doing what they're doing.
Yeah, so it may be helpful for those listening in to think about sort of 4 different layers of the web. And each of these layers have direct implications in terms of privacy policy and data protection settings. The top layer is applications, the things that we interact with every day as users. Right below that are websites, which are things, the World Wide Web, of course, instantiated back in the 90s. Below that is the browser, which is a type of application, but it sits on our side of the web, as it were, and allows us access to both websites and applications. And then at the very deepest level are operating systems that run our laptops, run our mobile devices, and they provide a lot of the key technology kind of power and control. And so what's been happening in the past several years at all these different layers, on the technology side, but direct market implications, have been slow but steady moves towards a greater set of privacy regimes. And Google is a good example of that. Apple really has led the way, which Tim can talk about in a second. But in 2 different of these layers, the browser and the operating system levels, both Google and just the past year has made some pretty significant announcements. At the browser level, they have talked about something called a privacy sandbox. The notion there is they have indicated that next year, 2022, third-party cookies are going away. Well, third-party cookies are the way that most entities, advertisers, and brands track users across the web from one website to another. So it's a tracking technology. It's one that has been quite successful, enormously financially remunerative for Google and others in that space, but also increasingly become part of the privacy conversation and debate, because it basically takes the agency out of the user's control, and their profiles and their behavioral indications are then made available to a vast array of folks. So Google has been signaling here through this change at the browser level and something called Flock, which is a federated learning of cohorts, which is a move away from individual tracking to a more collective tracking on an anonymous basis. The larger implication, just to take away from this, is that third-party cookies, third-party tracking is going away. Google will no longer be supporting it. They're looking for alternatives like this privacy sandbox, like this Flock example, which we talk about if there's any interest. But the point is, the third-party cookie is something that is going to be disappearing off the scene over the next year or 2. That's a huge deal. That is a game changer and a market changer right there.
Why is that a huge deal for brands?
Because most of the brands rely on third-party cookies and third-party tracking. It's something that, in addition to first-party tracking or cookies, right, or your direct engagement with your customers, it has been part of the portfolio of ways to assemble more comprehensive user profiles you can utilize to figure out and then and in turn create marketing campaigns, et cetera. So this is one of the elements of the arsenal that will no longer be there. So the implication, at least to me, is first-party relationships between you, your customer, client are going to become that much more important, that much more critical to success as the third-party cookies sort of fade away into the sunset. The other,
sorry, Richard. The one thing I would add to that, as far as brands, it really requires you to take a look at who you're partnering with, because there's a lot of data providers and agencies out there that are very cookie dependent, and if you're relying on them for key parts of your data, that's going to go away. So you need to reassess those relationships and make sure that your data partners can provide what they say they can provide.
I should also mention that some advertisers are looking at creating alternatives to the current third-party cookie system, right? So there's things called hashing and fingerprinting, ways to assemble profiles based on information like your email address, for example. And then you try to make it sort of pseudonymous or semi-anonymous so that you protect privacy. And Google and others have pointed out that those themselves raise real privacy challenges and concerns. And so they are not supporting those kinds of sort of incremental changes to the current system. So I think Google My sense is they will have their way here over time, whether it's through the privacy sandbox proposals or through other means. They have already signaled to the rest of the industry these changes are coming. Whether you like them or not, whether you adapt to them or not, they will no longer be supporting the third-party cookie world.
Now that's all under the guise of privacy, but so what are the real motives why Google might be doing this?
Well, Google, they have a pretty unique set of properties themselves. They've got YouTube, they've got search, they've got a host of other places that people go to the Google Play Store as a first-party client or customer or patron or user. So they're in a good position to be able to benefit from de-emphasizing the third-party cookies environment, where they do make money clearly, but by bringing the focus back to where they've got some unique advantages. Because people come to them, they like using their products and services there. So it really, it helps out in the name of privacy, and from their perspective, it helps protect what they think of as the free and open web. So advertising continues to support the web, so people can continue, for the most part, getting free services on the web, but it's just in a very different manner. And it gives them some cover now to be moving more towards a first-party cookie environment where they would benefit.
Thank you. And Tim, what about Apple? Tell us about Apple, what they're doing and why.
Yeah, so the Apple changes they're already here. They implemented most of them with the most recent updates to iOS and the Mac OS. And the two key things that Apple's doing is they're blocking device tracking, and they're making all user tracking on their platforms opt-in. So what does that mean? That means that if Facebook is tracking you via its Apple iOS app, they have to ask for your consent now, and you can tell them no, and you can block them from that access. So Apple's really doing a huge branding campaign around privacy. So I do believe that they're genuinely interested in that. That's one of their motivations, but it's also, to answer Milton's question about why are they doing this, they're also launching a major ad business within iOS and within their other properties that they can really benefit from having control over these data relationships. So I think you also have to look at all these in context. Like you have this massive change going on at Google. You've got the massive change going on at Apple, which are two of obviously the biggest platforms out there. But then you've got startup activity where you have companies like DuckDuckGo and Brave that are very privacy first and do no tracking whatsoever, that are experiencing significant market share gain.
These are search engines, right? Search engines?
These are search engines, but also browsers, to Richard's earlier point. So they're in that third, low layer of the web where they can really, they can make very credible claims about what they track and what they don't, because they have browser level control. And so I think it's a very dynamic, we'll talk about this in a minute, but then you have the changing legislation going on across the globe that's making these legally enforceable. It's a very dynamic and changing time for privacy and personal data.
So one question before we get into privacy legislation, just a quick answer. Richard, how is this likely to affect Facebook?
Well, Facebook finds itself in a tough spot because initially when Apple last year came out with this iOS 14 change, Facebook went on the offensive. They came out and they argued, among other things, in advertising and some policymakers, that they were supporting small businesses, that this was all, the third-party cookie world was actually a good place. It was the free and open web they were supporting. Frankly, a lot of folks didn't really buy it. And it's fair to say Apple has sort of won the PR wars around that, and they're moving on aggressively. And now that Google is essentially joining Apple a step or two behind, but still in a similar camp, Facebook finds themselves alone. And I think from a market perspective, but also from the policy perspective, we'll talk about in a second, they are isolated and they are going to be the target. They've got the big X now sitting on their backs.
Interesting. And Tim, what's your perspective on Facebook very quickly?
Very similar, that they're of the large networks, they're the most vulnerable right now. They were very heavily dependent on tracking users within iOS across apps. So they would, when you download the Facebook app onto your iPhone, you were consenting to letting them track you not only on their app, but on every other app you had installed on your iPhone. So that was an enormously rich data set for them that Apple has now cut off. So that's just one example of how these changes will have major impact on Facebook.
Okay, let's get into privacy legislation. So when you look at the landscape of the world, Richard, you influence privacy legislation in Washington, and I say that with all respect. So what do you see out there, GDPR, CCPA, and then the upcoming federal privacy legislation, please?
So GDPR, and thank you for that. I do what I can. GDPR in Europe in 2018 was the original, that was the first opening salvo in as a framework that encompassed a pretty comprehensive set of data protections and privacy rights for European citizens. Now in California, we have the CCPA, now we have the CPRA. Don't bother keeping track of the acronyms. So basically the point is we have now two different sets of privacy legislation adopted by the voters of California. They'll be implemented over the next couple of years, which are very similar to GDPR. It creates data controllers and data processors. It's a fairly complicated set of systems. But the one thing from the platform side, it's an enormous compliance and enforcement regime headache for them. They are now in a space, and this is a whole other reason why I think Google and Apple, particularly Google, I think are smart to realize all they're doing is buying themselves more and more aggravation by staying within the third-party tracking and cookie world. So moving away from that takes them away from some of that compliance risk. Now in DC, we've got now increasingly pressures for the US government to do something, in part because we're seeing this patchwork quilt of state laws, not just in California, but we now have one in Virginia, they're talking in Colorado, Washington State. So the more you have these state laws, particularly if they're inconsistent in their provisions, the platform companies, I think, have a good point to say, we can't stand to have 30, 40, 50 different data protection regimes, just give us one. So even Facebook is putting out full page ads in the Washington Post, pleading with policymakers to pass legislation. Why? Because they can get a preemption of these state laws. There's only one standard, which makes their compliance headache that much less. What that looks like, we can talk about some of the details, but it will be coming in the next 6, 12, 18 months. Okay. I think next year is the sweet spot for the US Senate to actually adopt legislation. And then depending on the politics and the logistics, very well could see something sitting on President Biden's desk before the election in 2022.
Okay, you heard that here first, folks. So he's not this is not inside information, but this is as expert as it gets. So Tim, give us your perspective on privacy legislation and maybe how US federal legislation is likely to compare to GDPR, for example, or CCPA.
Yeah, well, so first I would say that the way I like to describe it is that data privacy laws across the globe are in a mega trend of growth, right? So Gartner has a great statistic where they show that today, 10% of the world's population is covered by what they call a modern privacy law. They estimate by 2023 that 60% of the world's population is going to be covered by a modern privacy law. So that to me just says that across the globe, you're going to see more and more legislation coming out like this that really, I think they're going to build off the GDPR and the CCPA because they were the first, and there's so much thought that's gone into how you comply with those that I think people straying really far from those two are not gonna have as much success. So I think some of the key things that will be in like a federal law, I would say, are data portability, which is the ability to move your data from one platform to another. Data interoperability, which is to be able to use Facebook data on Google data on Apple, that sort of thing. The right to be forgotten is a really important right under both GDPR and CCPA that I would be shocked if it wasn't in the federal law. Is basically the right to pull back your data and say, I don't want to be a part of this anymore. So those are just some examples of this trend that's going. You got to think of it in two ways. It's global. It's not just the United States. It's not just the West. It's global, and it's building off those original principles that the GDPR successfully implemented a couple of years ago.
I think also it's fair to point out, really quickly, that what Tim says is completely accurate. And it's interesting, the GDPR, the original focus was on protecting people's privacy, protecting their data, where it is. And the people were essentially still deemed to be users. So the government's job to put in place a bunch of regulations that platforms had to comply with to ensure that the data wasn't held for quite as long, wasn't shared with quite as many people, that sort of thing. What he just mentioned, the right of data portability, the right of interoperability, a third one is a right of delegation of those same user rights to a third party, a trusted third party perhaps. Those are more about moving away from accountability for the platforms and more about agency and control for the users. That I think is going to be a key element of what we see in Congress next year. So it'll be mimicking GDPR from the sort of protect the data standpoint, but there's going to be this, I think, separate and really interesting avenue around promoting one's data rights, personal data rights through legislation that I think will actually help us create whole new market spaces and new opportunities.
And we're going to get that in a
Yeah,
second. So Tim, keep going, keep going.
Well, just to echo on that, that's a great point, because with the GDPR and CCPA, as Richard said, from a privacy standpoint, were great, and privacy geeks like us, lauded them at the time. But then when it actually came to making them practical for users and giving tools to users that they could really understand their data with, use their data with, sell their data or license their data, that took time. And you're starting to see in the startup community solutions for that, right? There's tools being built that help people, monetize their data or protect their data, remove their data. But I think that one of the important pieces of the newer laws will be that additional layer. So it's not just about protecting the data. It's, okay, we've got it protected. How do we use it? How do we make it practical? How do we make it understandable? And that's the real market opportunity for not only startups, but also brands that kind of embrace these new data models, we call them first party data models. There's a big opportunity to play in that space.
Okay, so let's get into what we would call personal data rights and data dignity. The reason we all met and we're in the same circles is because we all are champions of personal data rights. But that's easy to say. Describe it for our audience, please. Richard, why don't you start first?
Sure.
What does that mean?
Well, I jumped in a bit there prematurely, I apologize. But yeah, the idea is that data is this asset. It's a resource. It's something that if promoted in the right way with the right kind of players, as an individual or as a family, as a community, it enormously enriches my life. And so again, it's getting away from this sort of protective accountability world and opening up to say, I have rights to this data. I have rights that I can utilize it. I can share access with it. I can transfer it. I can destroy it. I can do whatever I want to with it, because it is basically a central aspect of who I am, my experience and my preferences, my interests at a digital level. So it's and Tim mentioned earlier, this idea of having fewer rights in the digital world than in the analog world. I had a similar realization when I was at Google, and it's deeply disturbing to think that the 21st century, the web is actually constraining us. And in fact, when it should be enriching us. And so the notion of personal data rights is simply taking a lot of the conceptions we have from our ordinary analog world and now introducing it into the digital context. So at the end of the day, data becomes something that represents us and also gives us power and control that we wouldn't otherwise have in the digital world.
So let me stop you before I hand it over to you, Tim, but I am amazed that I speak to CEOs, heads of digital, heads of consumer insights, marketing heads, executives, lawyers, and they don't realize that consumers own their digital platform data. They are stumped. I was with a CEO the other day and I said, did you know that you and your children own your TikTok data, Facebook data, Apple data, you name it? I went over and over. He said, I never even thought about it. And I had no idea that we owned our personal data. So I'm amazed that brands don't do that. So go ahead, Richard, elaborate.
One of the ironies is that in other ways, the web does constrict us. And there's a great book called The End of Ownership, which talks about, we don't really own the digital assets we think we acquire. That book we thought we downloaded from Amazon, that's not really ours. It's sort of a lease, right? The things we buy at the store that have software embedded in them, if we somehow want to fix that the way we could fix the device back in the the 50s, let's say, right. We can't, because then we violate the terms of the software agreement, right? So there's ways that the digital world actually constrains us. This is an exception, and as you say, this is something people are not really fully aware of, and I think that awareness level by itself, I think, could spark, frankly, a revolution in the way that we think about the web as an empowerment tool.
So speaking of revolution, Tim, why don't you share a couple of stories about how you came to your realizations and your epiphanies around data?
Yeah, I think so. One of the biggest epiphanies, and I would encourage everyone to do this after the call, is you go to Google or go to Facebook. Probably the easiest one is to go to Google Takeouts and download your My Activity file and just take a look at what's in there, and you'll be absolutely stunned. We have a tagline we use internally that just says, "This is you," right? The data is everything you've ever done on the Google platform from the first time you logged into that platform, whether it was searching YouTube, it was using Google Maps, doing a voice search. It has your voice recorded in there, sitting on some server at Google. It's incredibly rich data, and it's so rich it can't be delinked from the person, is the way I think about it. It is the person. It's just being, as Richard said, it's manifesting in a digital form. And if it is the person, then it has human dignity and human rights attached to it. And that's the right way to think about it. We haven't done that for the last 20 years of the web. We've done the opposite. We've thought of it as something that is machine ingestible and machine controlled, and we've taken all the personhood out of it. What these new laws do, exactly,
right?
And you know, Zuckerberg had the famous quote where he said privacy was dead, and privacy is fundamental to every human right we have, right? And so restoring privacy and then making that control accessible, usable, interoperable to the user is a profound shift in how technology has worked over the last 20 years. And so when someone like me sees Apple doing it, Google doing it, you know, the EU doing it, the US Senate doing it, this is a big shift, and it's multidimensional. It's going to be multi-decade, and like we've been saying, getting in front of it's going to be really important.
So I know that, Richard, you have been, and that's how we met. We co-wrote a white paper on data fiduciaries. Data, you know, because one thing is to say, okay, you have data mobility, portability. Sure, go to Google, do your takeout, download your data, and then what? Do I stare at it along with my table? Right?
That's always been the problem.
Right. So
you
Richard,
and the 7 people.
I made you as a big proponent of that. Yeah. So keep going.
Yeah.
Keep going.
You and the 7 people who know how to use takeout effectively and interpret what they're giving you, and do something with it, right? Which I think the platforms basically are counting on. They're not counting on the fact of you potentially having some trusted third-party intermediary to do that for you, that you delegate those access rights to, for example, which I'm hoping shows up in the legislation next year. So yeah, again, very similar to the theme that Tim brought up about how do you bring into the digital world the things that protect us in the analog space. He was talking about copyright for data. I've gone back to even beyond those days, earlier days of the common law of fiduciaries. And fiduciary law grew up in Europe and the UK, but increasingly is a part of all major cultures of the world. They call it different things. The basic premise is there's one entity or individual who has power over another based on superior expertise, superior access to information, and a sharing of confidences. So you open yourself up, you make yourself vulnerable by telling this person something about yourself. It has grown up in different professions where these power asymmetries are particularly acute. This includes doctors, lawyers, certain kinds of financial advisors, even librarians who vigorously guard your library records from the FBI when they come knocking after 9/11 happened. They act as a fiduciary on your behalf, whether you know it or not. Even parking lot attendants and dry cleaners, right? When they have your car or your favorite suit, they're not fiduciaries, but they have a certain what they call a bailment obligation, not to destroy your stuff, but to bring it back more or less intact. We have none of those rights today on the web. This is all stuff that's could have been hundreds of years of culture, and I think has served us pretty well to have these different areas where people with the expertise and the power, that we can write that by giving them these certain duties of care and loyalty towards us. So my humble proposition has been for the past several years, working with folks in Congress and elsewhere, let's facilitate and mark the market growth of a new class of intermediaries called a fiduciary, digital fiduciary, or a data trust in some other context that can represent me vis-a-vis the platform companies, and they serve my interests. I'm no longer just a mere user. I'm a customer or a client or a patron of somebody who actually, I am paying, I'm compensating, but in exchange, I'm giving them access to my data, and they're giving me access to a whole range of tools and opportunities to promote myself through my data.
And I think we all agree, before I turn it over to Tim, that this will unleash massive exponential economic power, economic value.
Yes.
Because, for example, to do personalized healthcare, we're going to have to give up our genetic, our historical, our Fitbit, our dietetic data combined into some trusted entity that is going to take care of our health and improve our lives and our health. And that goes for financial. I see a lot of lawsuits right now in fintech because there seems to be a violation of privacy. I'm not going to get into that, but that's prominent in healthcare. So Tim, I'm going to hand it over to you because when I met you, you were one of the purest forms of personal data rights advocates. And that's what I really enjoyed about when I met you. So share some of those concepts and how do you bring that to the marketplace?
Yeah, sure. So I definitely am a purist around it because I feel very strongly that people need to have these rights. They've been deprived of them, and that there are now very practical, technological, and legal ways to give them to people so that they're useful and practical, like we've been saying. So data is an economic engine, as you said at the outset, Milton. It's an economic engine for companies right now. What needs to happen is it needs to become an economic engine for people, right? So that they can really act like companies online and create valuable digital assets that they own and control, and that they can decide what happens with and what they get paid for or rewarded for sharing. So it begins with that level of portability and control, really, in my opinion. Really the GDPR, in my opinion, the key thing is portability, because it allows the consumer to take a step to regain control of this asset. Once they do that, all sorts of different things can happen, because now that they've got copyright control, ownership over this unique set of information, they can sell it just like a company would sell it. They can license access to it. They can do nothing. They can just protect it and have a backup of their data if they're ever deplatformed, which is a big problem right now on social networks. So once you port the data, once you make a copy of it and you have it under your control, this whole world starts to open up. And really what's happening now is companies are starting to figure out ways to make that easy for consumers. And also on the other side, once that happens, to make it easy for brands to directly access these consumers that now have control of their data and create direct first-party relationships with them. And there's, that's a big change for some, like there's a lot of CPG brands that have no direct connection to their customers. This is an opportunity for a CPG brand with no direct connection to go directly to the people that are interested in them and create a one-on-one relationship with their customers or their potential customers. So it begins with privacy and advocacy and getting control and porting that data so you have it, but then it becomes more market-driven and economic. And as long as the consumer's protected, they're consenting, they're protected by valid license agreements that they enter into voluntarily. And to Richard's point, they're working with trusted fiduciaries or other agents, which I think could be both AIs and people that do this on their behalf.
Okay. Interesting.
You're really opening up a whole second branch of the market, right? We've had siloed data for years, which has been great for Facebook and their shareholders and Google and their shareholders. But now you're opening up the silos a little bit, and you're creating a new branch of the marketplace, which I think is good for both the consumers. We'll talk about this in a bit. I think it's good for the networks as well.
So one of the things that you've elevated is going from privacy legislation. I think one of you said that was just table stakes, right? That was Richard. I think you said to me that was yesterday's news. That doesn't mean it doesn't need to execute, but that there's a much bigger opportunity for consumers and brands, right?
Exactly. Yeah, privacy legislation and privacy laws are necessary but insufficient in my mind. It is the table stakes, it's the ground floor. The exciting part now is building in the tools that will enable us to open up all these new market spaces to explore.
So Tim, is there anything that platforms like Facebook, Google can do to prevent consumers, if not legal,
yeah. So it's getting extremely tough for them to stop things like data portability. So they can't stop it in the EU, for example. Like that that's a non-starter for them. You're seeing that, like, the smart networks are getting ahead of this. Google is making it extremely easy for people to go get their data. Facebook is taking out full-page ads in newspapers across the country telling people that they have this right to go access their data.
Yeah.
Twitter, it's 3 or 4 clicks to get. It's very easy. So the really, forward-looking networks are kind of embracing this. Now, are they going to lobby hard in Congress to make sure that these new laws come out in their favor and that their core businesses remain intact? Sure, they are. But the thing is, one of the things we're learning is once you download Google data and you analyze it and you reapply it for a new ad model, where are you going to apply that ad model? Probably on Google, because it makes the most sense. Same with Facebook. So it could be that if they're really forward looking, they'll see that actually giving consumers control is going to lead to better advertising targets on their own networks. That's going to drive better conversions for them, drive more money for them, more activity. So it's potentially a virtuous circle, but we'll see. We've seen in the past that they've pushed us in other directions.
So Richard, you've lived inside Google and you know a lot of Googlers.
Yeah.
I've been introduced to many of them. So tell me about what you think the mindset is at Google right now with respect to empowering consumers in personal data rights.
Yeah, I think there is a recognition that ironically, people believe that Facebook and Google and Apple and the others have sort of figured out like the perfect formulation, right? They've got all the data, they've got all the algorithms, they've got all the smartest people in the world. They've got, let's face it, users love using Google products and services, and it supports the free and open web for many other businesses. So it's an admirable ecosystem in many ways. But I think even as that success is there, there's so much more they can do. And here's just one statistic to keep in mind. The last time I checked, this was sometime last year, 26% of people who use browsers, which is pretty much everybody on the web, have got an ad blocker on the browser. That means roughly a quarter of all users, and that number is steadily rising over time, are intentionally blocking out any advertisement from reaching them, right? Just think about that. That is a market. That is an opportunity. If there's a way to serve those people, to understand why they have concerns about the way advertising has turned, particularly with the third-party tracking mechanisms that we have in place today. If you can understand the mentality of that and figure out a way to serve those people, serve them, with trustworthy support, serve them with the kinds of tools and applications they want, and take away the creepiness factor, that's a massive market opportunity. So I got to think not just Google, but other platforms, and then increasingly startups are realizing the game is just starting. They didn't create the game and finish it, right? It's now we're now heading into the second half after halftime, and now we realize, whoa, wait a minute, forget about the score from the first half. This is a whole new game now. It's a whole new set of rules that we can create and new opportunities. So I think many of my former colleagues are now seeing this as a way to move beyond, ironically, the world that they helped to fashion in the first place.
And Tim, it's no secret that I'm especially on LinkedIn, an advocate for data marketplaces, right? Empowering consumers and brands, because I've never seen a conflict between consumers or brands, not ethical brands. Gucci takes care of me. Xenia takes care of me. BMW takes care of me. I don't see them trying to exploit me. I see them trying to keep me as a customer, a loyal customer. So talk about data marketplaces and how you think that's likely to evolve before we talk about what brands need to do to take action now.
Yeah, so right now all the information on the internet goes in one direction, right? It goes from us into the silos and up into those platforms that we really haven't had access to in the past. The new models are going to be much more bi-directional, right? They're going to, so when you elevate a consumer with these new kind of rights, data ownership, copyright of their information, ability to license it, they become like any other entity on the web. So they're just as powerful as Nielsen or Forrester or anyone else out there that wants to make an offer into the marketplace and say, this is my particular data set, or to link with a group of people and say, this is Richard, Milton, and Tim's data set that's highly unique, and especially if you're in a privacy startup, might be really unique, right? So they can make offers back to the brands that say, I'll give you access if you give me something in returns. Likewise, brands can do the same thing. We're looking for privacy advocates that do webinars, and so you get these very rich, very contextual direct relationships between consumers and brands in a marketplace setting where if people can't come to terms, no data gets exchanged. And that's what I think is really powerful about the marketplace model, is that you've got to have consideration for these contracts, and it's got to be reasonable on both sides, and both sides have to agree, otherwise nothing happens. So I think you'll see those emerging. Yeah.
I've read articles throughout the years where they said, consumers' data is not worth anything as an individual. You have to aggregate it. That's why consumers don't make any money on data. But I see these marketplaces allowing consumers to make up to tens of thousands of dollars a year in free room nights, airline upgrades, free meals, cases of wine, whatever, the brands that you love and you trust, to whom you license your data. Am I overly optimistic, Richard, or is there a reality there?
I think there's a real reality. In fact, I'll go back to the privacy sandbox that Google's trying to assemble for third-party data. The thing that they're utilizing, it's sort of the central, what's also attracted most of the attention and criticism, is Flock, the federated learning of cohorts, which is you move away from individuals and instead you're assembling people into cohorts based on their preferences and their interests that they have indicated through various profile data. I can see a similar thing happening in this space. So yeah, individuals, your power of your data is worth X amount of money as an individual. You can also, the more you share it, also that's also something. It's economic characteristics of it. You can share it and it still has value. You haven't lost value by giving it away to other people. In some ways, maybe gains value. But if you can then aggregate it, so then maybe it's a community of customers or clients, then they both are gaining more leverage in a sense in the market. But then to balance that, the brands are getting that many more insights from folks. So I think there's a real interesting way, and Tim mentioned the term feedback loops. I think that's really important. The feedback loops of getting to know your customer or your client, interacting with them, understanding them at their level, and then both as individual, but as family member, community member, on and on. I mean, there's these sort of concentric circles of interactions and relationships. The more you sort of get into that data aggregated over those times and spaces, I think can have that much more value than even just this particular slice of an individual's data.
Okay, so I'm a brand. I am Gucci, I am BMW, I am Colgate toothpaste, I am Tide detergent, I am Disney. So what are we to make of it? What should I be doing as a brand leader right now as a CEO? So tell me, what should I do, Tim?
Create first-party data relationships with your customers. That's the number one thing you can do right now for a bunch of reasons. One, it provides you, so like we've been saying, it's a very dynamic, multifaceted market change that's going on. And people like Apple and Google can make changes to key policies that take away key data sources overnight, and you're not prepared for it. So if you have a first-party data asset, you're protected from kind of the whims of the other players in the space. Second, you generate that direct connection with your customers, which, as we've highlighted, can be extremely powerful. And third, it allows you to go into new directions. You can make these new offers to your first-party panel that you really couldn't make to people. A lot of the other big problem with data and personal data on the web right now is that there's so much noise out there. There's so many bots. There's so much fake traffic. Half the time that when a brand is putting out an advertisement to, even on Google, they're advertising to fake entities that aren't even human. So having a direct connection with another human who's actually shown interest in your products and services is really powerful. And that's in a digital context that can be enhanced with AI, with fiduciaries, and I think can go in lots of different directions.
What do you think, Richard?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. The one other thing I'll add is customer support, right? Over the last 2 decades, the notion of customer support on the web, I think, has become, unfortunately, a very bad joke. Finding anybody to talk to help me with anything, it's just, you just sort of give up, right? But even beyond that, when we get into this new world of data access rights, it can be complicated. It'll be probably governed by laws and regulations. The platform companies and others may try to push back on you. So you, as an individual, will probably have a difficult time navigating that thicket. But if you have a brand or some other trusted entity that can help you, that provides active real-time support, that is there to answer questions, that's there to sort of help you along in the process, I feel that kind of, in addition to all the other things that Tim mentioned, that kind of outreach, I think people will appreciate. And it only does more to enhance the brand in the mind of this person to say, okay, it's not some anonymous person in some other country that doesn't understand my problem. This is somebody who actually cares and is trying to resolve something or help me unlock these rights that I've been told I have but don't really quite know what to do with.
Do you guys see any brands, there are brands or corporations, conglomerates championing sustainability. They are also championing equal opportunity and many other causes, right? Human trafficking. Do you see any brands having the resolve to champion personal data rights for their customers? Richard?
They should, absolutely. Yeah, because I think as much as those are very important social and sort of humanistic causes for us and for the planet, I think maybe not quite in the same way, but I think personal data rights is going to become something that once people are aware that they are there and that they can use them to benefit their lives.
That they own their data even, right?
And they own their data, they're going to be looking around for people to help them figure it out, right? So if there are folks who are ready and able to do that, I think I think, again, it's an immense opportunity.
So, Tim, I look at 23andMe and Ancestry and I go, why am I paying them to give me a profile, which is, basic Ancestry profile, and then they take my data and they sell it for billions of dollars to laboratories and pharma around the world? Why am I not, since this is my genetic data, participating in that? Do you see marketplaces for medical data, financial data, as well as consumer data?
Oh, definitely. And there's an interesting startup in Cambridge up here called Nebula Genomics, which is trying to take the 23 and Ancestry and flip that model so that the consumers are actually compensated under those big license deals. So that there's definitely a lot of startup activity around this space. And around like you were saying before, around advocating personal data rights and privacy. DuckDuckGo, the private search engine, is really growing fast. Brave just launched a private search engine today, which is—
I know, I literally just got the email. Isn't that funny?
Yeah. And they already have their browser has ad blocking built into it. So
right.
In the startup community, you're definitely seeing companies that are taking a privacy first standpoint and having success with it.
So if I'm a small company, one of our audience members asks, how do I benefit from personal data? What can I do? I'm not a conglomerate. I'm not a multi-billion-dollar company. Can I build relationships, first-party data relationships with my consumers? Is that going to give me advantage?
I would say absolutely, and we were actually just talking about this internally the other day. Once you have a data marketplace set up, there isn't really much of a difference between, your local pizza place asking to share data for rewards and a massive brand like a Gucci. So you could have very local markets that are very contextual. And the great thing about the social media data is it has tons of location data in it, so you could make a very localized offer to smaller businesses, right, that are in your general area, and you give them a proof that you actually are where you say you are, and that you're not spoofing it, and that you're not, over in Des Moines when you say you're in Boston. So I think there's a lot of very niche local markets that could develop.
And Richard, location data, it's some of the most precious data on the planet. There are companies built like SafeGraph are built only on location data and analyzing it for all kinds of insights. Is there a way that consumers going to be able to control that data, that location data soon?
Yeah, again, the beauty of it is that it's on your mobile device. The control is there. It just simply hasn't been given to you to this point. It's a GPS satellite 22,000 miles up in the air that's that's beaming back and forth, that's controlled by somebody else. So once one has the wherewithal to tap into that, and more importantly, be able to then provide access to that capability and the data that comes from it to the trusted third party, the brand or whoever it is, then you're taking that power away from those who are taking it surreptitiously, and you're voluntarily and openly giving it to somebody that you believe will provide benefits to you in return.
And Tim, if I'm an individual, let's say we talk about very wealthy individuals, they only want to share some data, right? So is it possible for consumers to have control of the data where they only share certain types of data? Can they have that kind of control, or is it a little too kind of general right now?
No, definitely. So the way we see it is that you download your data from wherever it is, whether it's Facebook or Google, you put it into a personal data store that you own and control. So think about it as a Dropbox file that's totally under your control. You're the only one with the password. You're the only one that can grant access to that. You can then decide what level of sharing you want to do and with which brands you want to share information with. So you can make it highly personalized. And remember, all these modern privacy laws have things like right to be forgotten. They have mechanisms to pull data back, right? And so that was the thing that was, that's a big change as well, because we've always owned our data because of, it's Section 230, the Communications Decency Act. So since 1996, we've all owned this content and data, but you couldn't really pull it out of the networks. There was no really easy way to get it back once it went in. Things like right to be forgotten, the ability to pull back information, the ability to port information and copy it, that changes that whole dynamic. It makes ownership real. So ownership without portability isn't real. So long way of saying, once you port, again, those other rights kick in, like limited access, no access. Yeah, exactly.
So Richard, do you envision a day when a brand misbehaves and consumers revoke their data licenses and leave them not completely naked, because obviously they have the first party data from transactions, if they have direct to consumer, but do you envision that data portability and data control by consumers will influence how brands behave, and of course make sure that brands don't misbehave because they'll pay a very heavy price for data loss?
Yeah, that's a very powerful tool for a consumer to have that they don't have today. I mean, in the analog space, we keep coming back to this notion about how you compare to the world that we have lived in before the web. If you don't like what somebody's doing, if you're unhappy with that meal, if somebody ripped your shirt at the dry cleaner, you walk away, you no longer give them business. Maybe you file something with the Better Business Bureau. Maybe you tell your friends, don't go to this establishment, right? Those were powerful indicators consumers had that went into the marketplace and had some effect. We have limited opportunity to do that today. Exercising one's data rights certainly would be, I think, a powerful way to do it. I also just want to mention quickly, we sometimes think of data in the same way that computer scientists and now platforms think about it. It's past behaviors, right? It's elements of my behavior from the past that are supposed to be inferences, indicators about how I might act in the future. But in some ways, the most valuable information is not necessarily the behavioral stuff you're scraping. It's the data, the information you're willing to share with a trusted third party like a brand about what you might want to do. I might want to take that vacation next month that I didn't think about until just now, right? And doesn't show up in my behavioral data. So it's all your intentionalities, which over time becomes more and more valuable. And the behavioral stuff, again, as valuable as it is, that's not quite the same person as I was, as last week as today or next week. So it really is about a continuum of relationship, and data is a central element of that. But I think sometimes we shouldn't get too hung up on this idea of the past behaviors, because for all of the immense value there, it's also about cultivating relationships that allow me to share more of myself, more of my personal information and data.
And your intent.
My intent to do things, absolutely, which may not show up in those behavioral trends.
Thank you. And Tim, you are an advocate of people actually taking control of their data, as opposed to doing it through an API or some other format. Why is that? I'm thinking that possession is 10/10 of the law when it comes to data, but elaborate on that a little bit, please.
Yeah, so the main reason, and it's a legal one, is so like I said in the beginning, the way that a lot of data companies, or most data companies online today, make money is they assemble valuable data sets that they own the copyright to. So they own the copyright to the database, not necessarily all the individual elements that make up the database, but the database itself. And that's how Forrester makes all its money. That's how Nielsen makes all its money. They license access to that. So for people to act in that same manner, they've got to create their own databases. And so that's what we're starting to see is technologies that let them do that. They assemble and aggregate as much information as they can. They turn it into a copyrightable database that they can show has some original assembly to it and is meaningful, and then they license access to it. So it's really, when you're doing it through API, I mean, the APIs can provide really, they can add to the information, they can update the information over time so it becomes more dynamic and less of the past, like Richard was saying. But that first step of getting control of that original data asset is really key from a copyright and licensing standpoint.
I can honestly say, speaking with brand CEOs, that this is information that I think they will be welcoming. Now, we're running out of time, so we have a couple of minutes left. What is the one thing, or what are the couple of things that you, Richard, would recommend to a CEO, given the flux, the disruption that's going on with personal data today? What actions can they take?
Well, I think Tim has touched on many of them already. I don't want to really go over that territory again. Because I'm a public policy attorney, I would humbly suggest they get involved in the political battles ahead, that they convey to their members of Congress through the appropriate channels that they want to see personal data rights enshrined in upcoming data protection legislation, that they want the right of data portability, they want the right of interoperability, right of delegation, the right to be forgotten. By the way, data portability as defined by Facebook may just simply mean you take your data someplace else that's another platform like Google or Amazon, may not mean take it to any place you want. And they talk in their ads about safe. Well, they could define safe as something that they believe has merit in terms of a security measure, for example, that might shut out lots of otherwise worthy third parties. So get involved in the conversations in Washington, because the next 6 to 12 months is going to be setting the time, really setting the framework for the rest of this decade.
So don't just be an advocate for data, be an advocate for human beings.
Human beings as represented by their data and as represented by you as a trusted brand who wants to find new ways of serving them, providing them with good business.
Thank you, Richard. And Tim?
I was going to echo that almost exactly, is that remember that data is about human dignity, and that we're about to face an onslaught of AI and machine learning that is going to overwhelm some people as far as their human dignity, and it's going to make human dignity harder to identify. And so it's a really, like Richard said, the next year or two are really critical to make sure that we protect this incredibly valuable asset, and also kind of human rights construct that we've always had, offline, that we bring it to this online context and make sure it doesn't get lost as these AIs start to dig into everything.
Somebody said people over profits, and I'm going to end that by saying that I don't think you have to make a tough choice on that, meaning that if you create human dignity, not only will you profit more because of customer loyalty, but that you'll benefit all of society. And with that, I just want to say thank you, gentlemen, and thank you all for joining us today. We're very grateful, and see you soon. Bye-bye, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.